my name is Kim Haynes. I am currently the assistant principal at Owens Crossroads School. It's a small rural school in Madison County, Alabama. We're just outside of Huntsville. I met Pam several years ago when I was teaching third grade. I was part of a history grant that Pam was leading, and it really changed the way I taught social studies to my children and the way that I thought about social studies myself. And so I have really enjoyed getting to work with Pam. She invited me to come and learn about exploring where and why over the summer. And so today I'm going to talk to you guys about exploring where and why, but specifically about the literacy library that is part of that program. So we will go ahead and we will get started. Okay, so like I said, today we are going to be focusing on literacy as part of the Exploring Where and Why program. Our agenda for today, first we're going to review the Exploring Where and Why program. I'm going to introduce you to our literacy library, walk you through that, tell you about the components of it. Then I'm going to share some sample activities with you, and then at the end we'll have a time to answer any questions that you might have. All right, first let's look back at our Exploring Where and Why program. We know that our Exploring Where and Why, or EWW, is a hands-on social studies program for our kindergarten through third grade students. We know that if our students are actively engaged, that they take in and retain more of what we're trying to share with them in our classroom. And that's why we refer to our program as a hands-on, minds-on program. Now, EWW is a social studies program, but it does reinforce a variety of cross-curricular skills such as reading, writing, oral language development, and math skills. Today we're going to focus on the ELA connections, and we'll also pull in a math connection so that you can see different ways that your literacy library can support your entire program within your classroom. EWW is an activity-based, developmentally appropriate program that helps our students develop those basic social studies skills. We know that everything that we do with our students has to be developmentally appropriate, and Nystrom has done a great job with the EWW program scaffolding the materials that are presented to our students so that everything is on a level that the students are able to understand and work with at an appropriate level. Right, here you can see a picture of the titles from one of our literacy libraries. This is actually the first grade literacy library, and that's what we will be working from today. We know that children that are read to and that are engaged in conversations tend to have a higher vocabulary, and we know the importance of a strong vocabulary, especially as so many of our states and districts are adopting Common Core. Social studies plays a critical role in vocabulary development. In fact, Robert Marzano asserts that about 55% of the vocabulary that students need in order to be successful in school comes from social studies. That's where our literacy library comes in. The books in our literacy library provide a perfect opportunity for us to both introduce and reinforce that important vocabulary. Your literacy library comes with each of our EWW kits. And in that literacy library, you're going to find 12 quality books that can be used to introduce or extend your EWW lessons. You're also going to find a teacher's guide that provides ideas for a variety of lessons for each of those books. And I'm going to jump into some of the books right now, and I'll give you just a brief summary of the titles so that you can kind of get a picture of the types of topics that are covered in your literacy library. The first one is Be My Neighbor. And this is a nonfiction book that explores the concept of community through vivid photographs and descriptions of neighborhoods all over the world. The Big Buck Adventure. This is a rhyming story, and a little girl is initially excited when she gets $1 to purchase anything she wants from a store. However, she quickly becomes overwhelmed by all the choices and all the eager store clerks, and she has to decide if she wants to spend her money or if she wants to save it. And I know that's a big topic with our first graders. They get $1 in their pocket and they can't wait to spend it. But this book really helps them walk through making some of those choices. David Goes to School. We are all really familiar with David, and I know our first grade students are familiar with David, and so this will be a fun book for them. In this story, David tests his teacher's patience by breaking all the rules at school, and David learns that there are consequences for his actions. And again, this is another concept that we really try to tackle with our first graders, and understanding that there are rules, and there are rules for reasons, and rules in our communities and laws and things like that, and David can really help our students to understand that. Firefighter. This is another nonfiction book, and it describes a day in the life of a firefighter. It includes information about how firefighters prepare for a fire, talks about the equipment that they use, and what they do once they get on the scene of a fire emergency. Forest Bright, Forest Night. This nonfiction book looks at the life in the forest. It's a rhyming text, and the flip it over format introduces the concept that some forest animals sleep during the day, while other animals sleep at night. 4 Seasons Make a Year. This is another nonfiction book, and it introduces the joys of the 4 seasons as they unfold on a little girl's family farm. The changes in the weather bring different crops and animals to the farm, and the students get to explore that throughout the story. They also get to see how the chores and activities change through the seasons. Grandma's Records. In this story, Eric lives with his grandmother every summer in Spanish Harlem. Together, they enjoy a summer of music from her native Puerto Rico. I Live in Brooklyn. In this story, 6-year-old Michelle introduces her colorful neighborhood in Brooklyn. She describes her life at home, her school day, and the many activities that she enjoys with her family. The Journey of Oliver K. Woodman. In this story, Tamika lives in California, and she misses her Uncle Ray, who lives far away in South Carolina. Uncle Ray can't visit Tamika, so he builds a life-size wooden man named Oliver to travel in his place. This book follows Oliver all across the country. And Roxaboxen. This is a book based on a true story of children who use simple materials and their imaginations to build a magical town in the desert called Roxaboxen. The children of Roxaboxen grow up and they all move away, but they never forget this very special place. And that was just a brief summary of the books that are contained in the first grade literacy library. There were 2 that I didn't mention, and those are the ones that we're going to look at as we go through the rest of the presentation. Another thing that I want to point out about your literacy library, if you look at the cover of your literacy library lessons, you'll notice that it's sort of a purple shade, and it is color-coded along with the rest of your first grade or second grade EWW kit. This makes it really easy to keep all of your materials together, and that kind of came to mind for me. I was thinking, it'd be great to partner up with a second grade teacher or a third grade teacher and share these materials so that you could do differentiated lessons. We know that in our classrooms we have students that are at all different ability levels, and the color coding makes it really easy for us to differentiate what we're doing with our students, but then get all of our materials back to their proper places when we're finished with whatever activity we were differentiating. Here you can see at a glance all of the titles in the literacy library and the lessons that Nystrom has paired each book with. Now, this is your table of contents, and it walks through each title, as I said, and it will say that, for example, grandfather counts could be used in Unit 1, 2, 4, 5, and 6. But I want you to keep in mind that as you're working through your EWW lessons, these are just suggestions of where these books can be plugged in. I know that as you're working through a social studies lesson, you're thinking about the titles in your literacy library and other ways that you can plug them in. This is a great place to start, but we use our teacher judgment, we use our teacher creativity, and we make connections through any lesson that we are presented with. All right, let's take a look at one of the particular stories in the first grade literacy library. This is The Other Side, written by Jacqueline Woodson. And this is a story about Clover, who's an African-American girl, and she's curious about the fence that separates African-American residents from the white residents in her town. Then Annie, a white girl who lives on the other side of town, begins to sit on the fence. Clover must decide if the fence will stand in the way of their friendship. Excuse me. All right, now if you look at if we look at our lesson guide here, we can see that this book is suggested to be used with Unit 1 and again in Unit 5. Now, I really like the idea of using a book towards the beginning of the year and then coming back later in the year and revisiting that same book. It's really interesting to me how our students, through a course of a year, how their thinking changes through all the other experiences that they've had with us in our classroom. If you use the book in the suggested lessons, it's going to move from a focus on kinds of neighborhoods to looking at our country's history. On our lesson guide, you can see that there are suggestions for using the book in a variety of content areas. You can see that we've got reading, and within reading we can look at fluency or vocabulary. We've got a writing connection, a social studies connection, critical thinking, art. You can see the T-chart that is comparing how people dressed then to how they dress now. You can see a Venn diagram that can plug in to whether it's reading, which we'll look at in just a minute. It could be something that you tie into another social studies component, comparing something particular that Clover did versus Annie. So we'll jump in and see how we can use this book in our classroom. As you begin using your literacy library, I would encourage you to read the story ahead of time, review the lesson guides, and see what activities you'd like to incorporate in your lesson. You'll find that a lot of times looking through these activities, it will spur you on to other activities that may not be listed in the lesson guide. For example, this lesson, I was looking at the fluency, and it draws students' attention to quotation marks and the use of dialogue. Quotations are sometimes difficult for our younger students to understand, so I use the term quotation mark and talking marks at the same time. And when I taught first grade, my little ones were always, they always understood it much easier when I used talking marks in conjunction with quotation marks. They know what it means when you're talking, so they instantly saw that and related it to somebody talking. It helps them understand that, that's what the quotation marks do. They tell us that a particular character is talking. And so to make this lesson my own, I would first read the story to the whole class. Afterward, we discuss the quotations and dialogue as well as the characters in the story. I'd assign groups of students to be the particular characters in the story, and I would act as the narrator. Then I would display the story on my document camera, and we would reread the story, but this time we would read it more as a play rather than the story, and that way the students can participate and see how the dialogue works throughout the story. They're going to see the exchange of conversation between the characters. Now, when you go through this lesson where you're talking about describing the characters and putting the groups, students into groups of different characters, that's going to be tying into your reading literature 1.3 standard, which says describe characters, settings, and major events in a story using key details. And with this story, and we're talking about those quotation marks, that's also going to hit reading fiction 1.1, where we're talking about an understanding of the organization and basic features of print. And so it talks about capitalization and ending punctuation, but we can also tie in the quotation marks and really pull that out for our students in a context that they can easily understand. Now, one thing that I always found when I taught in Florida, occasionally some of my Alabama would slip in and my students would catch something that I said that they didn't say in Orlando. And this particular page brought that out for me. On this particular page, we see that Annie says that she lives over yonder. And I really want to work with my students and help them to understand understand how to model and ask questions to clarify words in the story. You know, we all know that we come across words that we don't understand, but as adult readers, we know how to question the text. We know how to go to a dictionary, but we really have to model that for our students. So when we encounter words like yonder, this is a perfect opportunity for us to do a short little mini lesson and model for our students how to ask questions. So what I might do is I might think aloud to my students, you know, I know Annie says that she lives over yonder. I'm just not sure what that means. So when I don't know what a word means, I can ask questions to help me figure out the meaning. So, have I ever heard someone use the word yonder? I think I have. Have you? When I give you the signal, turn and talk with your partner about whether or not you have heard someone use the word yonder. Ready, go. Now, as I set this up, I'm going to have already established with my students who their partners are. We will have already practiced what our signal is, and they will know that when we say ready, go, that's their signal to turn and talk to their partner. And they're going to be talking about whether or not they've heard this word used before and in what context. After I've given my students a few moments to discuss with their partner, then I'll call them back together, and I will either share out some of the things that I heard them say as I was dropping and listening, or I may call on a couple students to share what they heard or what they discussed with their partner. Then that will be my opportunity to clarify as necessary, and then I'm going to remind my students that anytime they're reading and they don't know what a word means, we ask questions. We can ask our friend a question, we can ask our parent if we're reading at home, we can ask our teacher, and we're going to get that help to help us understand what unknown words mean. Now again, this is a really brief mini lesson, but I've really set the stage for modeling how to interact with a text. We know that reading is not a passive activity, but kids don't understand intuitively how to interact with our text. And just doing this mini lesson hits Reading for Information 1.4 that says ask and answer questions to help determine or clarify the meaning of words and phrases in a text. This is a simple mini lesson that you can use across any of the books in your literacy library. All right, so now we talked about the other side being able to be used in Unit 1 as well in Unit 5. So in Unit 5, we're going to use this with Lesson 4B. And in this lesson, students are going to learn how a child, Ruby Bridges, made a difference in our country's history. So I'm going to talk with my students about what bravery is and how Ruby Bridges demonstrated bravery. This is going to build their vocabulary, especially with that concept of bravery, through something that they can easily relate to. They can relate to Ruby because she's about their age, and it gives us a clear picture of what she did that was so brave. So I'm going to complete the EWW lesson, and I'm going to read aloud Ruby Bridges to my class. Now, after I've read that lesson, after I have completed that lesson, I'm going to reread the other side to my class. This is going to take place over a couple of days depending on the attention span of your class. And after we've read both stories, we're going to have a discussion about how both Ruby Bridges and Annie demonstrated bravery. Then with the class, we're going to use chart paper, or it could be our Smartboard or Promethean board, but something that's going to get the kids up and moving and give them an opportunity to interact with the lesson. But we're going to complete a Venn diagram to talk about ways that just Ruby showed that she was brave, or ways that just Annie showed she was brave, or maybe there were some things that they both did that demonstrated bravery. And we're going to complete our Venn diagram in that way. To differentiate this lesson, after we've completed our Venn diagram, students can complete a sentence frame that tells how Ruby Bridges was brave and how Clover or Annie was brave. Depending on the level of your students, you may say that they have to write 2 sentences that describe how Ruby was brave and 1 sentence that describes how Annie was brave. But you know what level your students are at, and you can adjust that writing component based on the levels of your students. Through this lesson, we're going to hit 2 more of those ELA standards. We're going to, again, describe those characters, settings, and major events in a story as we're talking about the characteristics of Ruby and Annie. And then we're going to be looking at Reading Literature 1.9, where we're comparing and contrasting the adventures and experiences of these two characters in two different stories. So while we're using this from a social studies perspective and looking at the concept of a significant figure and how they made a difference in history, we're also tying in those ELA components. And I know how tight time is in the classroom, so anytime we can cover multiple topics, it's a bonus in my book. All right, let's take a look at another story, Amika's Gift. And Amika's Gift is an African counting story, and all of the illustrations in this book are photographs, and I really, really like these photographs. It brings these things that kids have never experienced before. They're not going to get to put their hands on these different pieces of pottery and things, but they are going to get to see an actual photograph and get a better understanding of things that they wouldn't ordinarily encounter. So in this nonfiction counting book, Amika sets off to visit his grandmother who lives in the next village. The market is full of things that would make nice gifts for his grandmother, but he's got to decide which gift his granny would most appreciate. Now, we're going to be working with Amika's Gift in Unit 6, Lesson 4, and in this lesson, students are going to be able to locate continents on a map or a globe, and they're also going to be able to name countries on that continent. Additionally, as we work through the EWW lesson, students are going to learn about the children living on different continents. They're going to learn about the clothes they wear, the types of things they do for fun, maybe the food they eat. We'll be looking at our maps and globes, and so that's a huge social studies component, but we can come back and revisit this story in a math lesson. We want to stress to our kids that it's okay to reread a book. We don't read a book one time and put it away. Each time we read it, we can pull out something new. So after we've done our EWW social studies lesson and talked about the continents and the different countries on that continent, we're going to pull it in for a math lesson. Now, in math, in kindergarten and first grade, I know that children have to become proficient at counting groups of objects. They have to be able to read and write numerals, and they have to use a written numeral to represent a group of objects. And for some of our little ones, that's a difficult thing to do. So bringing in counting stories really helps reiterate that skill. Now I'm going to tell my students that we're going to be rereading a story, Amika's Gift, and I'm going to remind them that this is an African counting story. And I'm probably going to have some volunteers come up and find Africa either on a large wall map or on their globes. I may even have them turn to the atlas at their desk and find Africa. I'm going to explain to our students that as we reread this story, they're going to need to listen carefully to what Amika saw, because they're going to need that for an activity after we read the story. Then I will read the story to the class, and as we're reading, I'm going to give them a task to do. This is a perfect opportunity to give them just to shout out the number of words as you're reading along. We want to give them a task to keep them engaged as we read the story. After we read the story, I'm going to have the students return to their seats and take out their math journals. Then as a class, we'll create a list of what Amika saw. Now, in the front of in your teacher's guide, you'll see a sample list. I'll have my students writing it in their math journal, but I'll have a chart paper on the wall, or I'll write it on my smartboard so that my students that don't have as strong writing skills are able to see what they should be putting in their math journals. On the next day, I'm going to reread Amika's Gift to the class, and then I'm going to tell the students that as they listen to the story, they need to be thinking about things that they could include in a counting book. We'll read the story, and after reading the story, we're going to brainstorm a list of things that we could count as a class. I'll keep a list on the smartboard or on chart paper again. And then I'm going to guide my students in creating their own counting books. With this, you can easily differentiate the activity for your students. Lower level students, they can write items from the list that we created together, and they will only need to write the numeral to go along with their illustration. Your higher level students, they may be able to come come up with objects on their own that they can label, and they can write the numeral and number word. You may even want some of your students to write a sentence to go along with their picture and their numeral. Based on your students, you can differentiate that in a variety of ways. Now, this ties in to our numbers in base 10 standard, where we're counting to 100, starting at any number less than 120. In this range, we're going to read and write numerals and represent a number of objects with a written numeral. So you can see that we're creating that group of objects, and students are practicing writing the numeral that represents that object or that group of objects. Just a couple of reminders. You do have 12 books in your literacy library, and in your lesson guide, it points out different units and different lessons that you can use those books with. It's not going to be just one book in just one lesson. We're great teachers, and we can find a place to plug in things like nobody's business. So as you're reading through the lesson guide, as you're reading through the books in your literacy library and working through your EWW lessons, you're going to find lots of opportunities to incorporate these books throughout your classroom day. Use that literacy library lessons as a guide. Be creative with the way you incorporate these books. These are all fantastic titles, and I know that you're going to find lots of ways to incorporate them into your classroom.
If you would like to get in touch with me regarding anything about the Literacy Library Set, the Exploring Where and Why program, please email me, and I will be glad to have the Nystrom Education Curriculum Specialist for your region get in touch with you, and they can share with you about pricing or additional information.